40 miles west of San Antonio, there is a place on every Texas map called Medina Lake. What it no longer has is water. It still has a dam. It still has coordinates. It still has a name that families in this region have used their entire lives to describe where they live, where they fish, where their grandparents built cabins on the water. 1.9% capacity. That is what dead pool looks like when it stops being a warning and becomes a fact. The water dropped below the lowest outlet in the dam. The lake stopped functioning as a water supply. It stopped functioning as flood control. It stopped being a lake in any meaningful sense and became something that doesn't have a good name yet. A dry scar in the Texas hill country where a century of promises used to be stored. For 3 consecutive years, Medina Lake has sat below 10% capacity. Not below 50, not below 25, below 10. 3 straight years. No recovery, no relief in the forecast. 9 housing developments just turned away by the water utility because the water to serve them does not exist. And here is what every drought story, every infrastructure report, and every government declaration has carefully avoided saying out loud. The drought didn't kill Medina Lake. The decision to build a region on top of a water system that was never sized to support it, made quietly over decades by people who would never live to see the bill arrive. That is what killed Medina Lake. The drought just delivered it. Medina Dam was completed in 1913. The engineers who built it were not thinking about suburban sprawl or water utilities or growth projections. They were thinking about one thing: keeping farms alive through dry Texas summers. The Medina River fed the hill country. The dam would store that water. Farmers would irrigate. Ranchers would survive the seasons that used to break them. At the time of its completion, Medina Dam was the largest irrigation dam in the United States. It was built for a hill country that had roughly 15,000 people spread across several counties. A hill country where the loudest sounds at night were cattle and wind. A hill country where the idea that 78,000 utility customers might one day depend on this single reservoir would have sounded like science fiction. For most of the 20th century, the dam held up its end of the deal. The lake filled. It survived the Dust Bowl. It survived the catastrophic drought of the 1950s that broke records across Texas. It survived the dry stretches of the 1980s. Every time it dropped, it recovered. Every time the sky went dry, the sky eventually opened again. The engineers who built it in 1913 could not have known that their structure would outlast the assumptions it was built on. The dam still stands. It is structurally sound today. The water it was built to hold is gone. San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the United States. Austin sits 80 miles to the north and has been one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the country for over a decade. Between them, threaded through cedar and limestone and 2-lane highways, sits the Texas Hill Country. For most of its history, it was a place people visited. They came for the rivers, the tubing, the wineries, the pace. They came for a weekend and went back to the city. The Hill Country was scenery, not infrastructure. Then it became a place people moved to. Land was cheaper than Austin. Views were better than San Antonio. The pace was slower. The lots were bigger. And for families priced out of the urban cores, a house in the hill country looked like the Texas dream made real. Developers followed the people. Subdivisions followed the developers. New Braunfels became one of the fastest-growing cities in the entire country for several consecutive years. Comal County appeared on national growth rankings year after year. Kendall County, Bandera County, Blanco County, an entire region absorbing population at a pace its water infrastructure was never designed to handle, and never retrofitted to handle, because retrofitting is expensive, and growth is profitable, and the water bill doesn't arrive until it does. Texas Water Company, the utility serving approximately 78,000 people across these counties, watched all of this happen. They watched the demand curve climb. They watched the drought maps darken. They ran the projections. And then, in early 2025, they did something no water utility in a fast-growing American region had ever done at this scale. They said no. 9 housing developments in Comal County, capital ready, permits in order, buyers waiting, turned away. Not because the land was unavailable, because the water to serve them did not exist. Given current conditions, the utility stated, we must temporarily pause new service commitments to uphold our responsibility to provide customers water when they turn on their faucets. That sentence should stop you cold. A water utility in one of the fastest-growing counties, in one of the fastest-growing states in America, could not guarantee that water would come out of the tap. Not in a future drought scenario, not in a worst-case projection. Now, under conditions that existed the day that statement was written, everything you've seen so far, the lake at 1.9%, the dam at dead pool, the utility turning away developers, that is only half the system collapsing. Because underneath the hill country, in the limestone and fractured rock beneath every farm and suburb and new development, a second system is failing simultaneously. And unlike a lake, you cannot see it disappearing. You cannot photograph it. You cannot stand at its edge and watch the waterline drop. You only find out it's gone when you drill a well and hit dry rock. Dead pool is not a dramatic metaphor. It is a precise technical designation for a specific, irreversible condition. When a reservoir hits dead pool, the water level has dropped below the lowest outlet point in the dam. Water cannot flow downstream. The lake cannot release water for irrigation. It cannot supply downstream communities. It cannot function as flood control. It becomes, in every technical and practical sense, a large, landlocked puddle with no connection to the systems it was built to serve. Medina Lake hit dead pool in April 2025. Then it hit it again in May 2025, falling to 1.9%, the lowest level ever recorded in the lake's history. Lower than any drought in over a century of existence. And then it stayed there. Dave Mock, general manager of the Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District, described 3 years of watching this happen in exactly one sentence. It's just been so dry for so long. No technical language, no policy framing, no carefully managed statement, just the lived reality of a man who has spent years watching something irreplaceable disappear and has run out of ways to dress it up. For the farmers who built their operations around Medina Lake, dead pool was not a designation. It was the moment their irrigation source ceased to exist. Fields that had been watered from the lake for generations could no longer depend on it. The only door still open was groundwater. They walked through it, and that door was already closing. The Edwards Aquifer sits beneath the Texas Hill Country and has historically been one of the most productive groundwater systems in the United States. When Medina Lake dropped, when Canyon Lake started losing 34 million gallons per day, when surface water across the region became unreliable, the pivot was always the same. Drill deeper, pump groundwater, buy time. But aquifers are not backup generators waiting patiently for an emergency. They recharge slowly, over years, over decades, through rainfall percolating down through limestone and fractured rock. They recharge when it rains. And in San Antonio, since January 2026, total rainfall has measured 1.46 inches. That is 40% of normal for this point in the year. The city is running a 60% rainfall deficit in the first 2 months of 2026 alone. Stinson Municipal Airport on San Antonio's south side, 0.53 inches since January. Seguin, 0.7 inches. Pleasanton, 0.6 inches. These are not rounding errors. These are measurements from a region that has fundamentally stopped receiving the rainfall it depends on to survive. Robert Mace, one of Texas's foremost water scientists, has stated it plainly. The hill country is losing water from above through absent rainfall and losing water from below through accelerating aquifer depletion driven by population growth and development. Both systems are under pressure simultaneously. No redundancy, no buffer. 2 drains running at once with no faucet open to replace what is leaving. When farmers switched from Medina Lake to groundwater pumping, they were not solving the crisis. They were borrowing from a second account that was already being overdrawn by every new subdivision, every new development, every new utility connection in a region that kept saying yes to growth long after the water said no. Canyon Lake is at 60% capacity today. Medina Lake was at 60% too. And what happened between 60% and 1.9% is not a mystery. It is a documented, measurable, step-by-step sequence, and it is already repeating itself 40 miles to the east. The distance between where Canyon Lake is today and where Medina Lake already is may be shorter than anyone in a position of authority wants to say publicly. In the spring of 2025, photographs began appearing in local kayaking groups online. They showed people paddling kayaks through areas of Canyon Lake that had been open water just 12 months earlier. Not shallow water, not reduced water, open water, water deep enough to swim in, water where boats had anchored for decades. By spring 2025, those same areas had been reduced to knee-deep channels cutting through exposed lake bed, cracked sediment, dry soil baking under Texas sun, the ghost of a lake floor that was never supposed to see daylight. The images spread because they did something that no statistic, no government declaration, and no utility statement can do. They showed the before and the after. Water, then dirt. That is what 34 million gallons lost every single day looks like when it accumulates across months. That is what 4 years of compounding rainfall deficit looks like when it becomes landscape. That is what happens when the numbers stop being numbers and become the ground beneath your feet where a lake used to be. Canyon Lake still has water. It is still 60% full. There are still people putting boats in where the ramps are open. Medina Lake had water too. Governor Abbott has maintained drought disaster declarations covering more than 90 Texas counties in continuous effect since July 2022. The legislature passed water infrastructure bills worth billions. The Texas Water Development Board has programs, committees have met, studies have been commissioned. Catherine Romans, executive director of the Hill Country Alliance, spent 18 months building a regional plan with input from 2,800 residents. The plan prioritizes one thing above roads, schools, and economic development: water. Because without water, she has said, nothing else the Hill Country is trying to build is possible. The machinery of government response has been running. It has produced exactly what government response produces: reports, allocations, frameworks, timelines. Here is what none of it can do. It cannot make it rain. Here is the number that ends every optimistic conversation about the Hill Country water crisis: 45 inches. That is San Antonio's total rainfall deficit since 2022. 4 years of compounding absence. 4 years of the sky not delivering what the region's water math requires. 4 years of every proposed solution running into the same arithmetic problem. The water available does not equal the water committed, and the gap is not closing. It is widening. Medina Lake existed for over a century. It survived droughts that shattered records in their time. It survived the Dust Bowl. It survived the 1950s drought that broke ranchers across Texas. It survived the dry years of the 1980s. It survived because the demands placed on it never exceeded what the system could absorb during the recovery years that followed every dry stretch. That balance is permanently gone. The demands placed on the Hill Country water system today are not calibrated to what the system can deliver in a bad year. They are calibrated to what it delivered during the good years, the wet years, the full years, the years when the Edwards Aquifer was recharging faster than it being drawn down, and Medina Lake sat at 80%, and nobody needed to run the numbers very carefully. Those years are not coming back on the timeline that was assumed when the 9th subdivision broke ground in Comal County. Robert Mace has stated it without softening. The combination of drought and rapid population growth is creating a water stress scenario Texas has never faced at this scale. The math is not complicated. Growth added demand. Drought removed supply. The gap between those two numbers is where the crisis lives. Medina Lake crossed that gap first. It went from a functioning, century-old reservoir to dead pool in a timeline that shocked water managers who had been watching it fall. It happened faster than the models predicted. It happened before the policy response was ready. It happened while the subdivisions were still being approved, and the utility was still saying yes, and the growth was still being celebrated as prosperity. Canyon Lake is 60% full today. Medina Lake was 60% full once. The dam at Medina is structurally sound. The infrastructure performed exactly as designed. The engineers who built it in 1913 are not responsible for what happened to the water it was meant to hold. What failed was the assumption underneath everything, that the region could keep growing, that the rain would keep coming, that the system built for 15,000 people could absorb 78,000 utility customers and 9 more developments, and whatever came after that. Medina Lake believed that assumption too. The drought didn't argue. It just stopped raining. If you want to understand what happens when a fault line that hasn't moved in 300 years finally does, and why 13 million people living directly above it have no viable evacuation plan, The next video is the one you need to watch. Subscribe. The clock on this one has been running longer than anyone is comfortable admitting.